Well, first let me say I'm not going to be talking at all about my work because this is about history and about the history of interactions between USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, and the National Park Service in the century of the park's existence. So when the park was created back in February of 1919, it was already an international icon and popular tourist destination, as is reflected in this statement on the first page of the first report written by the acting superintendent of Grand Canyon, Williams Peters, to the director at the time. The canyon itself needs no description. It's being well known to practically all Americans and to thousands of foreign visitors. And this was in part due to, not entirely, but in part due to the work that had preceded the establishment of Grand Canyon National Park by a lot of very famous scientists that we all know, many of whom later became affiliated with the U.S. Geological Survey. I won't even begin to describe their contributions because we are quite familiar with them. And there was also, accompanying that work was a lot of illustrations, paintings, and photographs that helped to publicize this place to the American public. And these are just some examples of John Hiller's photographs, which I find so remarkable, the quality of these photographs that were being taken back in 1872. And of course, we heard from Dennis yesterday about the contributions of Francois Mathis and his colleagues Richard Evans and John Stewart and others in mapping the Grand Canyon prior to the establishment of the park in great detail. And then there were other geologists, lesser known perhaps, such as Levi Noble, who had already come into the Grand Canyon and done some very detailed geologic mapping of the area. And on top of that, we had USGS scientists. This is Nelson Horatio Darton, who had written a guidebook on behalf of the national parks that was being distributed by Fred Harvey. And this was being done in part to help publicize the national park concept to the American public. This little booklet, by the way, went into 48 editions. It was still being printed by Fred Harvey Corporation in the 1980s. And like I said, this is a picture of some of the early leadership of Grand Canyon and the National Park Service. Stephen Mather sitting down, Horace Albright, his deputy, and later the second director in the background. And then on the right, you see DeWitt Reyburn, next to him Walter Crosby, and then Goodwin. And these gentlemen were recruited by Mather very early in the process of establishing the national parks. And when Mather was setting up the National Park Service in 1916, actually 1914-15, he was looking for certain kinds of individuals to help lead the National Park Service organization. And he wanted people that were educated and had resourcefulness, were capable of working under remote, difficult conditions, and it didn't hurt to have a background in some government bureaucracy management. And so he turned to the USGS to recruit a lot of the early superintendents and leaders for the National Park Service. And I'd love to give you a story about all of that, but I'm going to focus on Grand Canyon here. So the very first permanent superintendent of Grand Canyon was a former USGS engineer, topographer named DeWitt Reyburn, shown there. And in fact, the first, out of the first 5 permanent superintendents, 3 of them were recruited from the USGS to lead Grand Canyon National Park. And they all also happened to have engineering backgrounds. In fact, all 5 of the first superintendents of Grand Canyon had engineering backgrounds. DeWitt had come USGS through some pathways to Mount Rainier, and then he was recruited to come to Grand Canyon. He eventually left and went on to a more lucrative career with the California Highway Department. The guy next to him, Walter Crosby, was not USGS. He was actually from the Army Corps of Engineers, but also an engineer. The third superintendent, Ross Eakin, was again a USGS engineer. He recruited Minor Tillotson, who was not USGS, but was an engineer. Minor stayed for over, I think, 12 years. And then the 5th superintendent, Frank Kitteridge, another USGS engineer. And part of the reason that Mather was recruiting so many engineers from USGS and wherever he could get them was because he also had this philosophy that for the national parks to be, and for the Park Service to be a sustainable organization, they needed a public constituency, and to have that, you needed good roads, you needed facilities, you needed infrastructure, and of course, when Grand Canyon was established, it was lacking in all of those things in good measure. And so I love this picture of early road building along the Eastern Drive area. Another early engineering feat was the replacement of David Rusk's cable car with the first Kaibab suspension bridge. And this opened up some opportunities for the USGS. See, maybe this works a little better. Opened up some opportunities for the USGS in the Grand Canyon itself. So the other thing about the early establishment of Grand Canyon National Park was Mather had this philosophy that it was better to get the parks into the park system and then worry about whether the legislation that had created them was actually perfect. And so, there were a lot of fights, as we know, about establishing Grand Canyon National Park over mining and grazing and other issues like that. And so when Grand Canyon was first established, the enabling legislation allowed for non-conforming uses such as grazing, mining on existing claims, and also for the development of water and power along the Colorado River. And so almost as soon as the park was established, USGS was in the mix in terms of looking for putting in some facilities in the Grand Canyon to enhance their capability for monitoring the flow and volume and sediment of the Colorado River. And with the bridge being established, that opened up that opportunity to establish some facilities down at Phantom Ranch. And so very early on, they went into looking into putting in a gauging station down here along the Colorado River, which is still there to this day. The little red circle showing where it was. These pictures were taken in 1923. The gauge was actually built in 1922. And in doing so, and they also built a little cabin for the hydrographer to live in when he was down there measuring flow and sediment in the Colorado River. And they worked very closely with the National Park Service landscape architect to ensure that these buildings would blend in with the style of architecture that the Park Service was already starting to promote at that time, this National Park Service rustic style, using boulders and logs and so forth. And there's lots of correspondence between USGS and Park Service to ensure that we were meeting the Park Service standards architecturally. As these pictures show, there was an expedition in 1923, right after the gauge was installed, to come down the river and survey it for the potential dam sites that were going to be developed in Grand Canyon, a story I think many of us are familiar with. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. A book has been written about this by Bob Webb, if anyone is interested. It's a great story. But nonetheless, the dams, as we know, did not come into reality other than, of course, Glen Canyon and Hoover downstream. But in the course of that, a lot of great data was collected, hundreds of photographs were taken, and a lot of that material continues to be used by the National Park Service to this day in studying the Colorado River in various ways. And it's also been adopted and used by river runners, incorporated into the very earliest guidebooks for the Colorado River. Sorry, Chloe, I didn't have the 1969 version of the original guide to show here, but right off the bat, it was being used for other purposes besides what it was originally intended, this information. USGS produced the first map of the Grand Canyon in 1926, using the data that had been collected by Mathis Evans and others. And in 1926 also, finally, after all this emphasis for the first 5-6 years on developing roads and infrastructure, they finally had enough breathing room, I guess you could say, to start developing more of an interpretive and educational program for visitors. And the first ranger naturalist, of course, was Glenn Sturdivant. And Glenn, as was common at this time, was not just a naturalist. He was filling in, helping out the ranger staff with patrolling fences. And also, as USGS scientists continued to come to the park and conduct research, he was sort of their gopher and helper and field assistant. And in return, the USGS scientists would give back to the national park by giving lectures to tourists and visitors. And there's lots of correspondence in these early superintendent's reports acknowledging the contributions of USGS to the educational program as well. I will just say that at this time, too, the Park Service, the other thing that Mather had done is when he was establishing the National Park Service, one of the ways he convinced Congress to finally go along with the establishment of the Park Service in 1916 was by promising the congressman that Park Service would always be a very small, very efficient organization. And one of the ways they were going to do this was they were going to rely on outside expertise to assist them with more specialized tasks. And so they were, he specifically talked about using knowledge from USGS and from the US Geological Survey, which later became Fish and Wildlife Service, and other federal organizations to provide that expertise. We know that didn't quite turn out that way, but that was the philosophy at the time. And so this was right in keeping with that. And by the same token, in developing the first museum at Grand Canyon, they turned to outside experts for that assistance as well. The National Academy of Sciences was called upon to assist the park in developing Yavapai Observation Station. And they put John C. Merriam from the Carnegie Institution, which was a privately funded kind of quasi-governmental assistance organization, research organization, in charge of the committee, and then he, in turn, called upon scientists from other federal institutions to assist him, which included USGS, Smithsonian Institution, Carnegie also was part of it. And so David White, who was this paleontologist that had been working in the park already, was called upon to assist with developing the fossil exhibits at Yavapai. And then they also turned to Francois Mathis to develop this three-dimensional model that was going to be sort of the centerpiece for the display at Yavapai Observation Center. And Mathis, who was based in Washington, D.C., was a Boy Scout troop leader, and he mentored some of his young neighbors in the area, who included the family of John and Eddie McKee, two brothers. And so when he was called upon, when Francis Mathis was called upon to develop this 3D model, he in turn recruited Eddie McKee to help him do this work. And Eddie had already shown interest in geology, and so that's how Eddie McKee came to the Grand Canyon. And the following summer, so Eddie McKee came with Francis Mathis and John Merriam in 1927 to look at the situation and help to start developing the museum. And then in 1928, he was actually hired as a junior, or what we call a seasonal interpretive ranger these days, to assist Glenn Sturdivant. And I think, as most of us are familiar with, unfortunately, Glenn, in February of 1929, unfortunately drowned crossing the Colorado River, coming back from a fossil collecting expedition associated with the development of the Yavapai Museum. And all of a sudden, young Eddie McKee, who by this time had just finished getting his geology undergraduate degree from Cornell University, age 22, was suddenly thrust into the position of being the new head naturalist at Grand Canyon National Park. And so Eddie was a geology graduate. He was fascinated by geology. He'd been working with geologists all this time, but he also had a much larger role to play. And so during the 1930s, which was the sort of the heyday of his career here, he continued to do his own research on the geology of the Grand Canyon, but there wasn't that much collaboration happening with USGS at this time. And I think in part there's a number of reasons. One, it was, of course, the Depression, and there wasn't funding really available to be either in USGS or Park Service to be doing a lot of extra research, if you will. And at the same time, he was suddenly thrust in this position of trying to manage this whole program, which of course included a lot more than just geology, included birds and beasties and plants, and working with the Native American tribes in this area as well. And so he did work with the Carnegie Institution. Again, that was also, in this time, the federal government was really encouraging the use of outside private funding to help support the parks in doing research. And so a lot of the collaboration that went on was in the context of working with the Carnegie Institution at this time. Well, he stayed on, and would have spent his whole career here, except for the fact that at this time the Park Service was really not encouraging rangers to stay in one park for their entire career. And in 1939, I believe, he was given a directed transfer to Yosemite National Park. And rather than leave his beloved canyon, McKee resigned, and he went to work first for the Museum of Northern Arizona, and then on to the University of Arizona. And in 1953, he was recruited by the U.S. Geological Survey and started working there, where he remained for the remainder of his 30-year career. He actually retired in 1977, but he kept working with the USGS until his death. And so during his time here, McKee produced an enormous body of work, not just while he was with Grand Canyon, but throughout his career. And so he started off with his Coconino sandstone study, and then he went on to looking at the Toroweap and the Kaibab, and then he got involved after he had already started this work while he was at the park, but while at the museum and at U of A, he started working on the stratigraphy of the Cambrian, and then he went to the Mokopi, and then he was working with the Red Wall. By the time now, he's well into his career with USGS, and then at the very end of his career, was wrapping up work that he had started again back in the 30s on the Supai Formation, and finishing it up while at USGS. And this monograph came out in 1982. Well, obviously, he was a rather older gentleman at this point, and so he recruited another young NAU graduate in geology, a guy by the name of George Billingsley, who also was briefly a ranger here at Grand Canyon National Park, to assist him with doing this field work with the Supai group. And in the course of doing that work, George had discovered or observed a formation which had not previously been observed, sandwiched between the Supai and the let me get this right, the Red Wall and the Supai Formation, so at the base of the Supai. And they produced together a little article about that, which came, this formation now is known as the Surprise Canyon Formation. And George, from there, was launched into his own Grand Canyon career that went for another 40 years, up to the, basically the present day, in which he was mapping all of the Grand Canyon, the entire part of it, and producing geologic maps throughout his career, as well as working in Canyonlands, Capitol Reef, Petrified National Forest, and other national parks. So I can't even begin to tell you about all the different USGS geologists who, over their careers, have worked in this area in the more recent years. A lot of it focused on understanding the evolution of the Grand Canyon. But I do refer you to Wayne Rainey's book, which summarizes the contributions of many of these individuals in terms of unveiling the story of the Grand Canyon and how it came to be on the landscape today. I will note that another area that USGS became involved in very early and continued into up to the present day was in terms of the water supply issues at the Grand Canyon, which of course have been a huge part of our concerns here all along. There was E.C. LaRue back in 1923 on that original USGS river expedition who started doing water research, water flow research on the tributaries of the canyon. And I love this horrible picture of the Indian Gardens pumping house going in the late 20s. It was finally finished in 1932. And that sort of took the pressure off for a while because water was being pumped from Indian Gardens up to the rim. And that worked until after World War II, when suddenly all these additional tourists started showing up here. And they needed another source of water. And so USGS was asked to do a water supply study for the South Rim, and they basically confirmed what the park had already sort of figured out by then, which was they were going to have to put a lot of investment into developing a system whereby they could bring water from the north side over to the south side. Oops, I went back one. So Centennial, 1969, Powell Centennial, and USGS produced 2 volumes at that time. One that was a more geologically focused one that had a lot of seminal articles in it. And they also did a river trip where they reproduced a lot of the photographs that had been taken by Hillers on Powell's second expedition. And that sort of opened up the door to the beginning of a whole new era of research in Grand Canyon. Oops, went backwards here. Which was understanding all the ecological changes that were happening in the Grand Canyon. And this is research that started back there at the very end of the 1960s and is continuing up to the present day. And that's the work that I'm involved with today through the Grand Canyon Monitoring Research Center. But that's not history yet, so we're going to have to wait for another few decades before we talk about that. And I just want to acknowledge the contributions of Colleen Hyde and Kim Beeson at the collections, and to Jenny Stevens and Clay Martin at the USGS Denver Library for all the help they provided to this presentation. Thank you.